It was a quiet Friday night, the kind where the rain taps against your windows like a persistent visitor, urging you to slow down and listen. I was 22 at the time, living in a modest one-bedroom house nestled in the cheaper part of town. It wasn't glamorous, but it was homey, a peaceful retreat where I could unwind after long work weeks. That night, the storm outside made the house feel even cozier, and I settled in with my favorite online game, headphones on, fully immersed in the world of flashing screens and camaraderie with friends. For hours, I laughed and shouted commands into my mic as the rain poured endlessly outside. The house seemed to settle in with me, every creak and groan of the old wood blending seamlessly with the storm's rhythm. It wasn't until close to midnight that I heard the first sound that didn't belong, a dull thud, faint but noticeable, from somewhere upstairs. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. At first, I dismissed it as the storm. Perhaps a tree branch had struck the roof, or the old pipes were acting up again. But as the minutes passed and the game resumed, my mind couldn't let it go. The sound replayed in my head, gnawing at my concentration. Finally, I excused myself from the game and pulled off my headphones. The house felt eerily quiet without the game's background noise. I stood still, listening, but the only sounds were the rain and the occasional rustling of leaves against the window. Shrugging it off, I convinced myself it was nothing and returned to my seat, diving back into the virtual chaos. Another hour passed, and by then, my friends had logged off for the night. I decided to grab a snack before bed and made my way to the kitchen. That's when I heard it again, a thump, louder this time, unmistakably coming from above. My stomach twisted into a knot as I realized the sound wasn't random. It had weight, purpose, and it was inside my house. Clutching the counter for support, I stared at the ceiling, trying to trace the origin of the noise. My house was small, with only a single bedroom, a bathroom, and a living room, nothing extravagant. But as I thought about it, my eyes drifted to a small, almost unnoticeable detail in the ceiling corner of my bedroom. It was a faint seam in the plaster, one I'd never paid attention to before. An attic. I hadn't even realized this house had an attic. I'd never been told about it, never thought to look. But now, the seam stood out like a beacon, and dread settled over me. Slowly, I walked to my bedroom and stared up at the ceiling. The thud had stopped, but the silence was worse. It hung heavy in the air, pressing down on me like a weight. Steeling myself, I dragged a chair to the center of the room and climbed up, reaching for the seam. My fingers grazed a small, concealed latch, and with a deep breath, I pulled it. The attic hatch creaked open, and a rusty ladder unfurled, clanging loudly as it hit the floor. A wave of cold, stale air washed over me, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet odor that turned my stomach. I leaned back, gripping the chair tightly as I stared into the dark void above. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The only response was the faint rustling of the wind slipping through the cracks. Grabbing a flashlight from my nightstand, I hesitated for a moment before climbing the ladder. My heart pounded with each step, the wooden rungs creaking under my weight. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow, dusty space littered with cobwebs and forgotten debris. At first glance, it looked abandoned, just an old, unused storage space. But as I swung the flashlight beam across the attic, something caught my eye. In the far corner, near a small, grimy window, was a bundle of cloth. It was out of place in the otherwise empty attic, and my heart sank as I realized it wasn't just cloth. It was a sleeping bag, flattened as though someone had been lying on it recently. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, unable to tear my eyes away. Next to the sleeping bag was an assortment of items: an empty water bottle, crumpled snack wrappers, and a notebook. I inched closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The notebook's cover was battered, its edges curled and stained. I crouched down, careful not to make a sound, and flipped it open. The pages were filled with scribbled notes and crude sketches, but what made my blood run cold were the words repeated over and over. "She doesn't know. She doesn't know." A floorboard creaked behind me, and I whipped around, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. My heart stopped as I saw a figure crouched just a few feet away, their face obscured by shadows. They were hunched on all fours, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. For a moment, neither of us moved. The flashlight beam illuminated their face, pale and gaunt, with an expression that was both fearful and predatory. I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance on the ladder. The figure let out a low, guttural hiss and scrambled toward me, their movements jerky and unnatural. Panic took over, and I scrambled down the ladder, nearly tripping as I hit the floor. I slammed the attic hatch shut and locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I grabbed my phone and bolted outside into the rain, dialing 911 as I stood in my driveway. My voice was barely coherent as I explained the situation to the operator. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive, my eyes never leaving the house. Every shadow, every flicker of movement in the windows made my heart race. When the officers finally arrived, they conducted a thorough search of the attic and the rest of the house. The figure was gone, but the evidence remained the sleeping bag, the notebook, and the chilling reality that someone had been living above me, watching me for God knows how long. The police told me the intruder had likely gained access through a small vent on the roof, one I hadn't even known existed. They assured me they would patrol the area and advised me to stay elsewhere for the night. I packed a bag and left, unable to shake the feeling of being watched even as I drove away. In the days that followed, I moved out of the house, unable to return without feeling a suffocating sense of dread. I never found out who the intruder was or how long they'd been there, but the memory of their eyes, wide and unblinking in the flashlight beam, still haunts me. To this day, I can't look at an attic without feeling a shiver run down my spine, wondering if someone is up there, watching, waiting,